Well, this morning we're going to start, this is a kind of a new sermon series that we're starting. It's called Plot Twist, and that we're going to be talking about things that kind of interrupt your life. But the first thing I want to talk about is when Courtney and I were first engaged, we met in Nashville, Tennessee, and we were going to a church there, and we had to take a premarital class before we could even get started. And it was a big church, and there was lots of people in the class. And so what they invited one of their members to the church to go talk about finances in your marriage. And that member of the church at the time, it was Dave Ramsey. Anybody remember him? Anybody knows who Dave Ramsey is? At that time, he was a member of the church we were going to, and it was like really early. I'm aging myself, but it was like in the beginning of his ministry and the things that he was trying to do, talking about no debt and those kinds of things. And one of the things that Dave Ramsey is really big about, right? He's really big, and he drills in your head. The very first thing he wants you to do is your $1,000 emergency fund. Make sure you have that $1,000. And he was just like, don't touch it. You have to have that just for an emergency. And he was very clear about what did not count as an emergency. He specifically would say bass boats, right? He was like, bass boats, that is not an emergency, right? Or a brand new car because you like that new car smell. For me, it would have been like, I really need that new guitar, right? No, he's like, that's not an emergency. Emergency fund were for the things, they were not for things that you just wanted. They were for things that you never saw coming. Things you never saw coming. So we did what we were supposed to do. And we started saving. And there were times in our life that it was really, really tough to put that line item. If you've ever done a budget and you have to, especially a Dave Ramsey budget, everything is accounted for. And it was very difficult to put that line item in there, emergency fund. Sometimes there were times in our life it was just a few dollars a week. And over the years, it seemed like almost every time we'd finally build that emergency fund back up. Guess what, right? Yeah. Boom. The bottom would fall out. The car would need repairs, right? The unexpected medical bill would happen. The air conditioner would quit in the middle of summer. It always seemed like we'd finally reached that point where we thought, okay, I think we're getting ahead, right? And then all of a sudden, bam, something happens. And I think most of us know, probably most of us in here, we know exactly what that's like. And it's not just financially, but your life, it starts looking up. And you feel like, man, I can finally catch my breath. And you begin to think, maybe things are finally settling down. And then something changes. You get that phone call, or you get that text. You get the lab work back. Or the company that you're working for, they need to make cutbacks. And it's moments like those that we start asking questions. All right, why does it seem like this happens every single time I get ahead? That life just knocks me back down. Sometimes we may even ask ourselves, what, did I do something wrong? God, where are you in the middle of this? And so as we dig into the Bible today, we're going to see that Joseph knew exactly what that felt like. Now, most of you have probably heard a lot of his story. You've probably heard of the coat of many colors and things like that, but it's okay if you haven't. And so before we read today's scripture, let's take a look at how Joseph got to the place that we are going to be reading about today. So when we meet Joseph in today's passage, he's not starting from a place of comfort. He's already lived through one hardship after another. A couple of chapters before where we will be today, Joseph is just 17 years old, and God told him, he gave him 2 dreams, and they point to a remarkable future, that one day that his family will bow before him, and God has purpose for his life. But before those dreams have a chance to unfold, life took an unexpected turn. And if you know anything about Joseph, you know that is an understatement. His brothers, they become so jealous that they conspire against him and they throw him into a pit, and then they sell him to a caravan of traders headed for Egypt. He's carried hundreds of miles away from his home, away from his father, away from everything familiar. And then he arrives in Egypt, and what happens? He is sold again. This time he is sold to a man named Potiphar, and he's an officer of Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. So at this point, if you have never read the rest of Genesis, you'd probably think that this could be the lowest point in Joseph's story. Maybe, hopefully, the worst is behind him. And after all, how much more could one man endure? But the story isn't over. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39 today. Genesis chapter 39. And as you're pulling that up, I just want to welcome all those who are watching online with us. It's good to have you with us, even though you're not in the room. So Genesis chapter 39, we're going to be starting in the first verse. So let's see what's going on here in Joseph's life. Now Joseph had been taken to Egypt. An Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made everything he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master and became his personal attendant. Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owned under his authority. From the time that he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned, in his house and in his fields. He left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So let's pause there for just a moment. Did you notice how much has changed in just 6 verses? Joseph went from being sold like property to managing one of the most important households in Egypt. He was no longer just another slave. He was trusted and he was respected. He was successful. But before we read any of that, we see something even more important. Look at verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. Don't miss the order here. Joseph was not successful and then God was with him. Joseph was successful because God was with him. Everything else in this story, it flows from that one truth. And the verse 3 says this, when his master saw, right? Potiphar, he noticed. Think about that for a moment. Think about it. Potiphar, he did not worship the God of Israel. But even he could tell there was something different about Joseph. And that should be us too. When we go out into the world, when we're in line at Walmart or somebody's got their cart right in the middle of the aisle and you're trying to get, we are to be the light of the world. People should notice something different about us. And so Potiphar, he couldn't fully explain it. He simply knew that whatever Joseph was entrusted with, it seemed to flourish. So Potiphar, he kept giving Joseph more responsibility. Until finally, in verse 4, he says this. He placed all that he owned under his authority, under Joseph's authority. Joseph was placed in charge of his entire household. And then verse 6, it really drives the point home. He did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. That was his only concern anymore. Think about what that means. Potiphar, he trusted him with everything. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that felt like for Joseph? For the first time in years, he could probably breathe again. For the first time being torn away from his family, someone trusted him and believed in him, recognized his character. It's possible that Joseph began to think, man, maybe this time, maybe my life is finally turning around. Think about all the stuff he went through. Maybe he's thinking, man, hopefully the worst is finally behind me. Maybe even wonder, man, maybe this could be where God is going to fulfill those dreams that he has given me. Right? After all, the pit, it was behind him. The slave market, behind him. And if the story ended at verse 6, we'd all probably breathe a sigh of relief, right? Joseph, man, he finally called a break. And that's what makes what happens next so heartbreaking. So let's keep reading. Now Joseph, he was well built and handsome. After some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." But he refused. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority. No one in this house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I do this immense evil, and how could I sin against God?" Although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. So Joseph, he has finally found stability. And then this one phrase, it changes everything. After some time. And isn't that the way it works many times in our life? It's not all at once. Sometimes it's not just this dramatic moment, but just when you've settled into a routine, just when you begin to think that life is becoming predictable, something changes. Potiphar's wife begins pursuing Joseph. And notice this, it was not just this one-time temptation. Verse 10 says it happens day after day. It wasn't just one bad moment. This was relentless pressure. Every single day. But Joseph said no. Why? Look at verse 9. He says, "How could I do this immense evil? And how could I sin against God?" Now, did you notice what Joseph did not say here? He didn't say, "I can't do that because I'm afraid I'll get caught." Right? He didn't say, or I'm afraid I'll lose my position. Or this could really ruin my future. He doesn't say that. Joseph had already settled something in his heart. His highest loyalty, it was not to Potiphar. It wasn't to his career. It wasn't protecting his future. His highest loyalty was to God. And that's where Joseph's story intersects with ours. Every one of us has something on the throne of our hearts. For some of us, it is success. For others, it's comfort. For some other people, it's approval. Whatever sits on that throne, the throne of your heart, will shape the decisions that you make. And for Joseph, God was on that throne. And that is why that he could say no. Listen, here's one of your points. It's one thing to honor God when obedience benefits you. It's another thing to honor him when obedience might cost you everything. Sometimes obedience will cost you everything. And that's exactly where Joseph found himself, right? Day after day, Joseph says no. Until one day, everything changed. Let's keep reading. Verse 11. Now one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the household servants were there. She grabbed him by his garment and said, "Sleep with me." But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. When she saw that he had left his garment with her and run outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so he could sleep with me, and I screamed as loud as I could. When he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." She put Joseph's garment beside her until his master came home. Then she told him the same story. "The Hebrew slave you brought to us to make a fool of me." This Hebrew slave you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, 'These are the things your slave did to me.' He was furious and had him thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph was there in prison." Think about what just happened. Joseph did exactly what God tells us to do when we are faced with temptation. He ran. He ran. He left his cloak behind, and he got out. He chose obedience over convenience. He chose integrity over compromise. He chose honoring God over protecting himself. And what was his reward? It was prison. And I think many of us have quietly believed something about the Christian life that simply is not true. We assume that if we are following God, if we're making wise decisions, if we're doing the right thing, then life ought to get easier. And when it doesn't, our first instinct to ask is, God, what did I do wrong? Now, sometimes our hardships, they are the result of our own choices, right? The Bible is very honest about that. And we're going to be talking about that in a couple of weeks. But not every hardship that we go through is. Sometimes you can honor God, and sometimes you can walk with integrity. Sometimes you can do the right thing and still find yourself in a situation that you never chose. Listen, some of the hardest chapters in life are not the result of personal rebellion. They are the result of living in a broken world. And I think sometimes we need to remember that we live in a broken world. And it affects our daily lives, right? People lie. People betray. Our bodies, they get sick. Jobs will disappear. Relationships, they fall apart. And sometimes there's not anyone to blame. If you're here today and you're still exploring Christianity, can I tell you something? One of the reasons I have come to trust the Bible is because it doesn't offer a simplistic answer to suffering. It doesn't promise that faithful people are exempt from hardship. Instead, it tells the truth about the world we actually live in. A world that is beautiful, but a world that is also broken. A world where faithful people sometimes suffer. Think about Joseph. Can you imagine what must have been going through his mind, right? Lord, I did the right thing. Lord, I honored you. I refused temptation. Why am I the one sitting in prison? Have you ever prayed a prayer like that? God, I did the right thing. So why is life getting harder instead of easier? Listen, obedience is not a bargain we make with God. We do not obey because it guarantees an easier life. We obey because God is worthy of our trust. And because whether we see the purpose of this chapter in this life or in the life after our life on earth, He has promised to never leave us. Joseph did everything right. He did everything right, did what he was supposed to, and instead of receiving a reward, he was thrown into prison. Doing the right thing did not make his life easier. It made it harder. They made it harder. So Genesis 39, it leaves us with one unavoidable question here. Where is God in all of this? And that's exactly what we will see next. Look at the first part of verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. And I don't know about you, But if I were writing Joseph's story, this is not how I would write it. If this was like a feel-good movie, if it was just Hallmark or something, right? Potiphar, he would discover the truth. Joseph, he would be cleared of every charge. Potiphar's wife, she would confess. Joseph would be promoted even higher. Roll the credits, right? But instead, Joseph goes from managing one of the most important households in Egypt to sitting in a prison cell. And from the outside, it looks like everything he worked for is gone again. But then we come to one of the most beautiful words in this chapter. But the Lord was with Joseph. But the Lord was with Joseph. And did you notice? That's exactly how this chapter began. In verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph. Think about this. Think about it. Joseph, his address changed, right? His circumstances, they changed. His job changed. His freedom changed. But one thing that never changed for him is that the Lord was with him. Don't miss what God's Word is teaching us. The Lord did not keep Joseph out of the pit. He did not keep him from slavery. He did not keep him from false accusation. He did not keep him from prison. But he never left him. Listen, one of your points this morning, God's greatest promise is not an easy life. It's that He is with us in every circumstance. That's why one of the names given to Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Not only when life is good, not only when the diagnosis is encouraging, not only when your job is secure, not only when the family is thriving, God is with us in the waiting. He is with us in the disappointment. Even in the chapters we never would have chosen for ourselves. And here is something fascinating. The prison begins to look a lot like Potiphar's house. Let's keep reading. He, the Lord, granted him favor with the prison warden. The warden put all the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority. And he was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden did not bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And the Lord made everything that he did successful. So once again, Joseph, he proves faithful. And someone notices. And then he is entrusted with responsibility. Because although Joseph's circumstances changed, his character did not change. And neither did God's presence. So I was preparing this message. I was thinking about that emergency fund. We still use that. And I still hate when I have to use it. Right? It's no fun. It does not feel good to watch this money that you've worked hard for just all of a sudden just disappear because of an inconvenient situation. But over the years, we have learned something about this. When we use that emergency fund, it doesn't mean that the emergency fund failed. It means it did exactly what it was there to do. It did not prevent the emergency from happening. It helped us through it. And in a similar way, God never promised life would be free from unexpected turns. He never promised there would not be disappointments or betrayals or setbacks. What God has promised is even better. God has promised His presence. The Lord was with Joseph in Potiphar's house. The Lord was with Joseph in prison. And because of Jesus Christ, the Lord is with us. Not because every story ends the way we hope, but because He has promised, I am with you always. Even in the chapters we would never have chosen. So we spent a lot of time this morning in Genesis 39. And if that were the last chapter of Joseph's story, it would be kind of discouraging, right? I mean, things are happening, but he's still in prison, right? He's innocent, and his reputation ruined, and a future that looks uncertain. But that's not where the story ends. Have you ever seen those like coming of age movies where at the end they say like Billy Bob went to go be a surgeon and Teresa went to be a teacher, those kinds of things? I love it when they do that. So let's fast forward for just a moment and look at what happened to Joseph. So Joseph, he remains in prison. And while he's there, God gives him the ability to interpret the dreams of two officials who serve Pharaoh. Joseph tells one of them, the cupbearer, that he will soon be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. And that's exactly what happens. So before the cupbearer leaves, Joseph says, hey, when you're standing before Pharaoh again, please remember me. But he doesn't. And so Joseph waits for 2 years. For 2 more years. And then Pharaoh has a dream. And then Joseph is remembered. And he's brought before Pharaoh. He interprets the dream. And Pharaoh places him second only to himself over all of Egypt. And looking back, the one thing is clear. That God never lost control of the story. Even in the pit, even in slavery, when he was in prison, God was at work. Joseph couldn't see it, but God had been faithfully accomplishing his purposes all along. So years later, his brothers come to Egypt looking for food. The dreams God gave Joseph as a 17-year-old finally come true. And it's not because Joseph manipulated the circumstances. It's not because he got lucky. It's because God has been writing the story far bigger than Joseph could ever see. See, we look back at it, we read it now, but I can imagine when he's actually living this story that we read about, he doesn't know what's happening. So eventually Joseph, he looks back over every difficult chapter of his life and he says to his brothers, you planned evil against me, God planned it for good. But don't miss this. Joseph could only say those words by looking back. When he sat in that prison, he didn't know that he would be in the palace one day. He didn't know that there would be reconciliation. He didn't know how God would weave all those painful chapters together. All he knew is that the Lord was with him. But before we go any further with this, I think it's important to remember something. It's important to remember this. Joseph eventually lived long enough to look back and see what God was doing. But not everyone does. Some faithful believers never experience that kind of resolution in this life. Some relationships are never restored. Some diseases aren't healed while living on this earth. Some injustices are not made right on this side of heaven. The Bible never promises that every story or every chapter that we live through has an earthly fairy tale ending. But what it does promise is something even greater than that. That the Lord will never leave his people. And that because Jesus Christ, that he rose from the dead, our future is secure in him for those who put their faith in him. And maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you're living in a chapter that does not make any sense to you. Maybe you're wondering how any of this could possibly fit into God's plan. Sometimes years later, right, we're able to look back at what's happened and see God's faithfulness. And look, I hope and pray that happens for you. But even if it doesn't, our hope has never been that every question gets answered in this life. Our hope is in Jesus Christ. Because he lives. And because he lives, we know this chapter is not the end. So as we wrap it up today, one thing I'd like to remind everyone here is this. Okay? One of the reasons God gave us the church, not the building, but the people here, the church, is because none of us were meant to walk through these unexpected paths alone. Listen to what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians. He said, Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort. He comforts us all. He comforts us in all our affliction, so that we may be able to comfort those who are in any kind of affliction through the comfort we ourselves received from God. Did you catch Paul's point here? God doesn't just comfort us for our sake. He comforts us so that we can become a source of comfort for someone else. Like a river flowing through. There are people in this room who have walked roads they would have never chosen. They have buried loved ones. They've endured betrayal. They've faced frightening diagnosis and broken dreams and seasons where they wonder, where are you, God? Listen, they can't take away your pain, but because God met them in theirs, they can sit beside you, and we can sit beside them, and we can say, let me tell you about the faithfulness of God. And one day as God comforts you on your unexpected path, you'll be able to do the same for someone else. So don't walk the path alone. You lean into the body of Christ. Let others remind you of what is so easy to forget in the middle of the story. That God is faithful even when you cannot yet see the whole story. If I could have our musicians come up, please. And if everyone could stand. I want to leave you with one question. What chapter are you living in? Maybe you're in the pit. Maybe you're in Potiphar's house. Maybe you're in the prison. Maybe you have done the right thing, right? And you're wondering why life became more difficult instead of easier. And if that is where you are, don't mistake this chapter of your life as the end of your story. Right? You may not understand what God is doing, but you can know what Joseph knew, right? You can know that the Lord is with you. And because of Jesus Christ, He is always